You sit quietly somewhere, your skin tingling with the memory of touch, whether soft, sharp, or deliberate. That feeling, both intimate and foreign, feels like an unspoken language your body speaks before your mind does. It's a language inked in shapes and colors, mapping out a terrain that no one else quite understands but you. If you are someone who wears tattoos, not just as art, but as a form of living declaration, then you've felt this paradox. Your skin tells stories no one else dares to talk about, and yet it shields stories deeper than any words ever could. You are navigating a hidden psychology, one layered beneath the visible ink. This psychology is not simply about rebellion, it is a complex, haunting dance between possession and liberation, between a need to be seen and a necessity to protect the vulnerable parts of yourself that once could not speak. It is here in this hushed tension that the core paradox reveals itself. The tattooed woman is caught between the ache of silence imposed by others and the fierce imperative to reclaim her voice through the body. There is an invisible thread weaving through every choice to mark the flesh. It originates from a psychic wound, an internal fracture born in the unseen shadows of her formative years. This wound grows quietly, an ache she often carries alone, behind eyes that smile but say nothing. And the tattoos? They are a sacred map of that internal terrain, a makeshift fortress built of ink and needle, designed to claim sovereignty over a physical self that was once denied sovereignty of spirit. You might wonder what compels a woman to step into this paradox. Is it defiance? Is it ritual? Is it an act of pain or healing? The truth is layered like the ink in her skin. Each line and dot, each swirl and symbol is a palimpsest of survival. It is a silent scream that dances on the edge of visibility, a negotiation between vulnerability and protection, between betrayal and trust. The tattooed woman embodies an ancient archetype that Carl Jung hinted at, but never fully spoke aloud. The woman as a living canvas of repressed history and unresolved grief. Her tattoos are not merely decoration, they are psychological signposts carved into the map of her identity, signaling the hidden psychic terrain where survival and sacrifice collide. You feel this tension inside yourself, whether you have ink or not. Perhaps you have been misunderstood, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. Maybe your external body tells stories your heart hasn't dared to voice aloud. This is the silent drama of a hidden psychology, the battle to forge meaning, where scars, internal or external, often seem too raw or too blazing to face without armor. Your nervous system remembers what your conscious mind cannot yet articulate. It remembers the moments when you needed to disappear, remain silent, or create a boundary so powerful that no one could cross it. Tattoos, then, become a symbolic armor for this ancient nervous system defense mechanism, a declaration etched in skin that you will no longer be unseen, unheard. This story is not just about ink or skin, it is about an emotional sacrifice, an unseen grief that ripples beneath every choice to mark the body. It is about a woman's relationship to herself and the world, a silent message to the cosmos that her interior life is worthy of both pain and beauty. Pause now and breathe into this mysterious space. This paradox of the tattooed woman is not fixed. It is alive, shifting, and aching to be understood. It invites you to peer behind the surface, to see the interplay of light and shadow, the depth of psychological survival written in ink. As we journey through this layered realm, you will begin to recognize something universal inside this specific archetype, the deeply human desire to reclaim the self through the body when language has failed, when silence has weighed too heavily, and when the spirit fights to be known. So, here you are, on the edge of an intimate exploration. The inked layers will reveal more than just patterns and color. They will uncover the hidden psychology of tattooed women, tracing the threads back to wounds, defenses, and ultimately the profound act of reclaiming voice and autonomy through the very skin that was once a battleground. Feel the quiet resonance of this truth. What the eye sees as ink is in reality the language of survival, complex, unspoken, and aching to be honored from the inside out. Chapter 2: Archetype Analysis. Definition and symbolic description. The tattooed woman you see before you, or perhaps within, is far more than an aesthetic choice, a trend, or a surface level self expression. She is an embodiment of a powerful archetype rooted deep within the collective psyche. Carl Jung called archetypes primordial images, ancient universal patterns existing beyond cultural bounds, playing out endlessly through myth, art, and human experience. The tattooed woman, as an archetypal figure, is a living symbol of wounded sovereignty, a figure whose body becomes both a canvas and a shield for repressed stories, invisible wounds, and psychic survival strategies. To unpack this archetype, you must first understand what it fundamentally represents: the intersection of visible control and invisible chaos. On one hand, the tattooed body belongs to a self who has wrested authority over her own flesh, a reclamation of autonomy. On the other, it whispers of deep psychological complexity, of sacrifices, silenced traumas, and defenses that were once necessary for survival, but now haunt the internal landscape. This archetype is neither new nor merely contemporary. It echoes the ancient rites of initiation, the tribal markings that once connected the body to identity, pain, and transformation. In many indigenous cultures, body markings, scars, tattoos, paint were sacred. They told stories of loss, achievement, passage through darkness, and connection to ancestral spirits. The tattooed woman inherits this legacy, but in a modern world layered with stigma and misunderstanding, her markings often become misunderstood symbols. What exists beneath the stain of ink is a complex conversation between the psyche and the body that Jung's framework helps us decode. At the root of this archetype is what Jung termed the wounded feminine. This powerful image is not simply about gender, it is about the relational wound, the psychic rupture inflicted by neglect, betrayal, or silence in formative childhood relationships. It is the archetype of the woman who carries, often unconsciously, the emotional burdens of being unseen, misunderstood, or suppressed by those entrusted with her care. The wound is not merely individual, but echoes a more collective feminine experience, one of minimization, erasure, or the engulfing shadows of patriarchal structures. The tattooed woman externalizes this archetypal pattern. Her body becomes a container for what was once internalized grief, rage, and defiance. The ink, in this sense, is like a psychic incision, a way to mark territory not only physically, but metaphysically, a silent manifesto declaring, I am here, I am. Yet within this declaration lies a paradox. The very act of marking signals an original injury in the first place, the need to protect the self because earlier protections failed. The symbolic language in her tattoos often follows unconscious scripts. Images of serpents may symbolize transformation and rebirth, but also danger and betrayal. Mandalas can represent wholeness, sought through fractured inner worlds. Wolves or lions echo a call toward primal strength. but also the loneliness such strength entails. Each symbol marks a territory in the inner psychic geography, where the archetypal wounded feminine wrestles with her own shadow, the parts of herself denied or rejected by family, culture, or even herself. It's important to understand that the tattooed woman archetype is also a defensive mechanism of the nervous system, an ancient body brain evolutionary response to trauma and disconnection. The attempt to own body space through permanent markings signals a neurological attempt to restore a fractured self. Her nervous system, once hypervigilant or dissociated, craves a O of physical control and narrative expression that verbal language and social norms denied her. So the tattoo becomes a tactile anchor, a sensory truth that speaks where words fail. This archetype is not always conscious. The choice to tattoo the body may emerge as a spontaneous, sometimes compulsive need, a ritual of self authorization. Tattoos become a language of embodiment, a dialogue between internal need and external reality. The woman who chooses this path is often unconsciously attempting to rewire her nervous system's survival circuitry, negotiating space on her own skin to assert safety and identity. Jung's model reveals that this archetype is a bridge between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Personal wounds, passed down through family dynamics, interlock with the broader cultural and ancestral narratives about feminine power, autonomy, and visibility. The tattooed woman lives in this liminal space, the borderlands of history, psychology, and embodied selfhood. What makes this archetype particularly compelling is its contradiction, its tension. She is both a warrior and a guardian, a poet and a prisoner. Her body is both a fortress and a diary. Tattoos might hide scars that are raw, or they might invite questions that no one dares ask. This ambiguity becomes a mirror for the viewer's own hidden separations from self, between what is owned and what remains disowned within. Art has long recognized a woman in this paradox, the muse who inspires but who must suffer for her art, the victim who becomes survivor, the sacred bearers of pain who refuse to disappear. Tattooed women modernize and materialize these age old roles into a visible, visceral form. In short, understanding this archetype means seeing beyond surface assumptions about rebellion or aesthetics and recognizing how deeply layered survival strategies become intertwined with identity. The tattooed woman is a living testament to the resilience of the wounded soul, a soul that was once dismembered and now fights to reclaim wholeness on her own terms through the inescapable medium of flesh and ink. By framing her behavior and appearance through this archetypal lens, we begin to see the tattoos not as mere decoration, but as symbolic signatures of an ancient psychological defense. Jung might say they are the shadow, made visible, or better, illuminated on skin. In the upcoming journey, you will learn how this archetype's roots dig into not only childhood trauma, but also into the fundamental ways the nervous system has adapted, rewired, and continues to negotiate its fragile equilibrium. You will discover how these profound psychological ideas resonate through the very act of tattooing, revealing a narrative that pulses beneath every line, dot, and swirl. The tattooed woman, then, offers you a mirror, an invitation to witness an ancient unspoken pact between body's psyche and survival, a pact inked into the skin, unavoidable and eternal. And it is here, inside this paradox, that we start to uncover what Jung glimpsed, but did not fully articulate, the silent language of wounded sovereignty spoken loudest in the ink of the tattooed woman. Chapter 3: The Psychological Foundation, Nervous system rewiring. Your psychology is an ancient battlefield, a landscape where past wounds persistently shape present realities. For the tattooed woman, this battlefield is as tangible as her skin, each inked symbol a silent testament to internal neural rewiring, born of to truly understand the hidden psychology wrapped in the act of tattooing, especially for women whose marks run deeper than mere decoration. You must first grasp the profound ways the nervous system adapts to trauma, dissociation, and the hunger for bodily autonomy. The nervous system is not just a silent messenger of sensation, but a dynamic entity constantly responding to threat and safety cues. When early relational environments fall short through neglect, emotional unavailability, or outright violation, the nervous system encodes these experiences as danger. This encoding creates patterns of hyperarousal, dissociation, or chronic shutdown, setting a covert stage for how identity and embodiment will evolve. Three psychological concepts stand central here: somatic memory, nervous system regulation, and the polyvagal pathway. Together, they reveal how tattooed skin is not just surface, but an active participant in the psyche's attempt to reclaim wholeness. First, somatic memory, a concept rooted in both neuroscience and trauma psychology, reveals that the body holds on to what the mind cannot process. And traumatic experiences are not only locked into isolated memories, but encoded in muscle tension, skin sensations, posture, and subtle nervous system cues. The tattooed woman's body is an archive of these somatic memories, and the act of tattooing functions as a ritualized touch point with this archive. It brings into conscious awareness what was once silent, allowing a tactile dialogue between pain and healing. Unlike verbal memory, somatic memory resists linear narrative. It is cyclical, layered, often fragmented, and tethered to emotional arousal states. Tattoos mark this invisible landscape. They become a physical language decoding the somatic scripts of fear, vulnerability, or rage sent by the nervous system during moments of disconnection. Second, nervous system regulation or dysregulation is the key battleground where survival strategies play out. When early relationships fail to provide adequate co regulation, the nervous system defaults into self protective modes: fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. These states function as primitive, automatic defenses to maintain life, but at cost. The chronic dysregulation narrows the window of tolerance, the range in which the nervous system can safely feel and process emotion without overwhelm. Tattoos then become a paradoxical method of regulation. The intense sensory experience of needle and ink injects a controlled form of physical stimulation, grounding the nervous system in the present moment. While the needle pricks the skin, sometimes painfully, it activates the somatosensory cortex and the interoceptive system, those parts of the brain tracking bodily sensations into internal states. The tattoo artist's needle functions in this context like a mediator between chaos and order. It can recalibrate the nervous system by providing predictable somatic input that challenges dissociative shutdown or hypervigilance rooted in early trauma. The tattoo experience enables the wearer to reclaim agency over her body's boundaries in a way verbal therapy or internal reflection might not reach immediately. Third and most compelling, Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory offers a scientific framework, illuminating why this bodily reclaiming is critical. At its core, polyvagal theory frames the autonomic nervous system as more than a dualistic fight or flight mechanism. It posits a hierarchy with three neural circuits: the ventral vagal complex, safe social connection, the sympathetic nervous system, mobilization, and the dorsal vagal complex, shutdown and immobilization. In cases of developmental trauma or relational neglect, the dorsal vagal shutdown may become a default state, a psychic numbness, dissociation, or self erasure. The tattooed woman's body, through the ritual of marking, stimulates the ventral vagal pathways indirectly. The needle's controlled stimulation, together with the intentionality behind the tattoos, serves as a neurobiological invitation to re engage with the body's capacity for safety and social engagement with self and others. This dynamic explains why many tattooed women describe their tattoos as awakening, homecoming, or transformative armor. Beyond aesthetic, the tattoos operate as repeated sensory anchors, resetting the nervous system's baseline from disembodiment or shutdown toward regulated presence. Yet, this rewiring is neither simple nor linear. The nervous system tables old wounds alongside new meanings. Every tattoo is both a flashpoint and a refuge, eliciting complex emotional waves ranging from pain to empowerment, shame to pride. This oscillation is itself a mirror of the nervous system's fluctuations, a continual negotiation between vulnerability and defense. This process parallels the neuroscientific understanding of neuroplasticity. The brain and nervous system are remarkably malleable, capable of forming new neural connections in response to experiences. The tattooed woman's repeated engagement with her skin's sensory threshold through needle pain, visual symbolism represents a form of self directed neuroplasticity, consciously or unconsciously stimulating a rewiring of old trauma pathways toward new possibilities of identity. One might compare the nervous system to a heavily trafficked city. Trauma creates bottlenecks, detours, and roadblocks in its traffic flow. The tattooing experience acts like a construction crew, opening new routes and detours through the city's terrain. Some routes lead to painful neighborhoods long avoided. Others lead toward vibrant plazas where the self can gather and thrive. Within this rewiring, the concept of embodiment surfaces as vital. True embodiment is the lived experience of being fully present and integrated within one's body, senses, and emotions. For the tattooed woman, the journey of embodiment often begins with reclaiming skin as a site of agency rather than alienation. When the body was once the scene of silent suffering or dissociation, tattooing becomes a statement. This body is mine. Here is my narrative. This act of reclaiming embodiment challenges not only internal psychological wounds, but societal narratives as well. Culturally, tattooed women have often been stigmatized, labeled as defiant, reckless, or damaged. But beneath these surface attitudes lies a profound evolution of self recognition. Tattooing pierces external judgment to birth a new dialogue between inner wound and outer expression. Because neurological survival is at stake, tattooing becomes a lived ritual of psychological homecoming, one that engages multiple layers: biological, emotional, symbolic. The ancient brain, in juxtaposition with modern ink, creates a temporal bridge where trauma's echoes can be confronted and rewritten. To further grasp the nervous system's rewiring, imagine two fundamental dynamics at play: dissociation and integration. Dissociation is the psychic mechanism where parts of experience are split off to avoid overwhelm, like islands disconnected from the mainland. Integration is the reunification, the gradual bridging of these islands back into a coherent whole. Tattooing often starts as a dissociative act. Cutting symbols into skin can numb, distract, or compartmentalize. Yet, if navigated with intention and support, It has the potential to foster integration. Tactile sensations stimulate awareness, deliberate symbols trigger internal narratives, and the persistent visual presence of ink weaves the psyche back toward wholeness. For many women, ink serves as a limbic system letter, unseen repressed memories, and chronic nervous system dysregulation into conscious view, enabling both acknowledgement and eventual healing. In essence, the tattooed woman does not merely wear her past, but physically translates it into language the nervous system can digest and reorganize. She is a living proof that healing is less about fixing and more about rewiring in the nervous system, in the psyche, and in the fragile domain of selfhood. This chapter gives you a profound insight into why tattoos for many women exceed simple aesthetics. They are the visible outcome of an invisible internal revolution, a nervous system fight for safety, presence, and voice in a world that often demanded silence. As this understanding unfolds, a deeper empathy emerges, not only for the tattooed woman, but for every person whose body carries stories their mind cannot yet tell. The nervous system's ancient languages of survival often look like pain, defiance, silence, or ink, but behind them lies an enduring drive toward reparation and reclamation. In the following chapter, you will witness the emotional cost hidden beneath this remarkable survival mechanism. You will begin to trace the invisible grief and philosophical weight tattooed skin carries, the unspoken sacrifices made in shadows, and why way. Mark is also an elegy. From nervous system to heart and spirit, the journey goes deeper. Chapter 4: The Emotional Cost, Invisible Grief and Philosophical Weight. Beneath the beautifully etched ink lies an invisible river of grief flowing silently, often without words or recognition. The tattooed woman carries this emotional toll like a shadow twin, unseen by the world, yet endlessly present within. The cost she bears is not superficial, it is existential, philosophical even. It is the quiet surrender to losses that no one else witnesses, and the paradox of marking the skin as both a gesture of reclaiming self and a reminder of what was never fully won. This grief is invisible because it is not a single dramatic event, but a cascade of small betrayals, missed connections, and silences that accumulate over time. It is the slow unspooling of a narrative where belonging was conditional, where voice was stifled or dismissed, and where the tender self was often sacrificed for survival. The tattooed woman's emotional landscape is an uncharted terrain of wounds that were once disavowed, yet still pulse beneath the surface like a smoldering ember. Imagine grief not as a mere feeling, but as an ongoing condition, a chronic ache in the soul's architecture that shapes every relationship she enters, every boundary she erects, and every secret she guards. This grief exists in parallel with the strength she projects. Underneath the armor of ink, vulnerability waits like a breath held long too tightly. Philosophically, this grief unsettles foundational questions about identity, autonomy, and the human condition itself. It forces a reckoning with the paradox. How does one become whole when the self has been shattered or fragmented? How do you claim your narrative when significant parts of your story were erased or made invisible early on? What does it mean to mark one's body in permanence when the internal wounds crave healing, not simply masking? The tattooed woman is caught in this dialectic between honoring wounds through visible expression and mourning the deep loneliness this expression sometimes reveals. Every symbol inked carries dual meaning. It is both a talisman of strength and a notation of loss. The snake that curls around an arm may be a sign of transformation, but also a reminder of betrayal. Floral motifs may represent rebirth, yet inevitably bloom from soil watered by pain. These layered meanings cannot be untangled easily because they mirror the complexity of human suffering itself, where love and loss coexist, where desire and fear dance in eternal tension. The tattooed woman's story becomes a meditation on the paradox of healing. The act of reclaiming autonomy often resurrects memories that challenge the very sovereignty she seeks. Invisible grief, therefore, is a form of psychic inheritance, not always handed down knowingly, but felt and absorbed in early relational patterns. It grows from the wounds inflicted by those meant to protect or nurture, but who instead imposed silence or control. This grief folds onto itself silently, creating a cavern within where echoes of abandonment, invalidation, and betrayal endlessly reverberate. Yet within this cavern, the tattooed woman performs an extraordinary act of defiance and creativity. To mark the skin is to declare, I am here, I am seen, and I refuse to be erased. The cost of this declaration, however, is carried in daily moments of emotional labor, the effort to contain shame, the fear of being misunderstood, the heavy burden of living at the threshold between visibility and invisibility. The existential weight of this survival strategy is profound. It is not simply about pain endured, but about the ongoing negotiation of meaning in life's most intimate spaces. Tattooing becomes a ritualized attempt to externalize internal grief, to hold it more gently by shifting it from opaque darkness to something palpable, something that paradoxically can be reshaped. This reshaping is essential because grief left unexamined corrodes the self, creating psychic fissures that escalate into alienation or despair. But when the tattooed woman confronts her grief through her body, she invites a slow alchemy, a transformation where pain becomes story and story becomes identity. How does this emotional alchemy manifest in everyday life? It colors her relationships with an underlying tension, an oscillation between intimacy and withdrawal. Often the tattooed woman's presence can be magnetic, drawing others with her raw authenticity, while simultaneously guarding fiercely against potential judgment or rejection. This push and pull creates a relational dance marked by both craving and defense, reflecting the unconscious reverberations of the child who once longed to be held and heard. Moreover, the emotional costs ripple into the realms of self esteem and identity stability. Living with profound wounds means carrying an internal dialogue that vacillates between self empowerment and self doubt. The tattoos, as visible manifestations of survival, sometimes become shields against this internal turmoil, symbols that say, I have endured, I am strong, yet they can also evoke shame or internalized societal criticism, reminding the woman of the cultural marginalization tattooed bodies. Still, this duality creates a silent grief of invisibility paradoxically juxtaposed with visible anomaly. The tattooed woman can feel both hypervisible and profoundly alienated, tethered to a psychological landscape that often lacks language or acknowledgement. This is a grief that calls for philosophical interrogation. What does it mean to be embodied in a body that simultaneously invites gaze and repels understanding? How do you reconcile the need to be seen with the vulnerability of exposure? This tension often leads to internal conflict. The tattooed woman's relationship to her body can be fraught, sometimes a source of pride, sometimes a source of shame, sometimes a canvas of self love, other times a map of trauma. This internal push pull mirrors larger existential questions about human embodiment itself. Jung's idea of individuation captures this beautifully, the lifelong process of integrating shadow and light, pain and beauty, fracture, and wholeness. In this light, tattooing becomes less about permanent decoration and more about a psychological dialogue, a somatic negotiation where the invisible emotional cost is inscribed alongside symbols of strength. It is an ongoing work of psychic synthesis, a painstaking effort to bridge the internal schisms inflicted by past wounds. Philosophically, the tattooed woman stands at a liminal juncture, a threshold between her past pain and the possibility of healing. Her tattoos are a palimpsest, writing over old stories but never erasing them, carrying traces of sorrow and survival in equal measure. This leads to a profound question hovering over the emotional landscape. Where does this unexpressed fear, the core energy fueling the need to mark the body, actually come from? Is it a primal wound from early caregiving failures, a shadow cast by cultural narratives about female embodiment and agency, or perhaps an echo of ancestral trauma silently scripting itself across generations? As this question lingers, it invites the tattooed woman and anyone who witnesses this archetype to move deeper into understanding, to see not only the surface ink, but the subtext beneath, a psychic saga of sacrifice, invisibility, and the relentless pursuit of autonomy. It is this invisible grief and philosophical weight that define the deeper emotional architecture of the tattooed woman. To honor her journey is to acknowledge that every line etched on skin hides volumes of silent sorrow, resilience, and hope. You carry this grief, whether tattooed or not, as a profound, unspoken human condition. And as you sit with this, prepare to meet the core fear that courses beneath it, a fear that complicates everyday life, threads itself through intimate moments, and yet holds the key to understanding the paradox of survival itself. Chapter 5: The Core Fear and Daily Life Complication. Fear, a quiet, relentless pulse that hums beneath the surface of the tattooed woman's daily existence. It is a shadow that flickers just beyond the edges of conscious thought, yet it profoundly shapes every step, every glance, and every interaction. To truly grasp the hidden psychology of tattooed women, you must understand this core fear, not declared aloud, rarely fully named, the primal dread that complicates the simple act of living and being in the world. The fear repeats itself, echoing in the silent chambers of her mind. I am not safe to be fully seen. Like a refrain, it envelops her internal world and external surroundings in a cloak woven from threads of wariness and longing. This fear is not an abstract concept. It is a visceral reality that drapes over the body like a second skin. It is the fear of judgment, the fear of abandonment, the fear irreparable fragmentation. Repeat to yourself, I carry the weight of being unseen. Yet I fear what will happen if I am seen too deeply. This paradox forms the emotional crucible where the tattooed woman's psyche contends daily. The fear destabilizes boundaries, fractures sense of belonging, and fuels the internal tension between craving intimacy and erecting walls. The origin of this fear is tethered to early life experiences, the developmental moments where safety was conditional, where being whole meant negotiating invisibility or silence. The tattooed woman's nervous system learned to anticipate threat in places where safety was supposed to reside. Her psyche internalized an unspoken code. To survive, I must hide parts of myself, perform resilience, and create armor. This fear finds expression in seemingly banal moments, when dressing to conceal scars, when hesitating to reveal certain stories, or feeling the sting of a glance cast in silent judgment. It colors the way she inhabits space, often pushing her between hypervisibility and invisibility. She fears dismissal and yet expects it, a double bind embedded deeply in the nervous system wiring. In daily life, this manifests as a persistent vigilance, a nervous scan for potential threats of rejection or humiliation. Social encounters, romantic intimacy, professional spaces all become arenas where the core fear plays out favor or sabotage. The tattooed woman may smile with assurance, but inside a storm rages. Will they understand me? Will they see beyond my surface to the wounded self beneath? You might notice this fear intensifying when others focus on her tattoos, not in curiosity but judgment. The ink becomes a symbolic flashpoint, signaling difference, provoking unconscious biases or discomfort. These moments can re traumatize the original fear, social erasure transmuted into adult exclusion. The body, after all, is a primary site of identity, and when it is scrutinized, the embryonic wound reopens. Moreover, this fear is closely linked to the dread of abandonment, the core relational wound from which many psychic defenses grow. Abandonment here is not merely physical, but emotional and symbolic. The despair of being left behind in the psychic dark, decoupled from attachment and belonging. The tattooed woman's marks become metaphorical seals of this fracture and simultaneously cries for kinship. This core fear complicates even the simplest moments, standing in a crowded room, sharing personal vulnerability, deciding whether to trust a partner, or walking alone in a public space. Routine experiences become slalom courses, weaving around threats both real and imagined, threats that echo long past neglect or hurt. This fear also impacts how the tattooed woman regulates her emotions. The nervous system, primed for survival, swings between hyperarousal, where feelings flood unbearably, and hypoarousal, where numbness takes refuge. The core fear becomes amplified during these states, making presence in the moment precarious. Emotional expression may be constrained, calibrated carefully to avoid triggering abandonment or judgment. Patterns emerge. She may develop a compulsion toward control over body, environment, or narrative as a preemptive defense. This control paradoxically binds her tighter in fear, even as it fosters a sense of autonomy. Tattoos serve here as both control and release. They allow her to script parts of her identity in a way she can manage, while also confronting deeply ingrained vulnerabilities. Repetition compounds the fear. Every social rejection, every glance of disapproval, every reminder of stigma builds a quiet archive of psychic injury. The cumulative effect is a precarious internal balance, her sense of self akin to a fragile house of cards, brilliant yet vulnerable to collapse. For some women, this fear fosters resilience, a fierce resolve never to be invisible again. For others, it catalyzes cycles of withdrawal, distancing, or self sabotage. The tattooed woman oscillates between these poles, embodying a dynamic tension that mirrors her internal paradox, to be seen, yet fearing the consequence of sight. This core fear also knots itself tightly with shame, a powerful corrosive force. Shame tells her she is flawed, unworthy, or deviant. The ink, often stigmatized socially, can become a mirror for internalized shame. But paradoxically, these tattoos also allow externalization of shame, bringing it into the light where it can be examined and eventually transformed. Because this fear and its emotional consequences are so deeply embedded, it influences interpersonal relationships in profound ways. The tattooed woman may construct walls to keep others at bay, simultaneously craving intimacy, but suspecting betrayal. Her inner world becomes a carefully guarded territory where trust is rationed and vulnerability strategized. In romantic relationships, this core fear can manifest as cycles of idealization and devaluation. Deep hope for connection quickly followed by withdrawal at the slightest threat. The relational dance becomes fraught with tension and misunderstanding as unresolved childhood dynamics about safety replay in adult patterns. The fear also complicates the relationship to self. She may question her worth, her right to occupy space, or feel defined rigidly by external marks rather than internal essence. The tattoos, like double edged swords, can be sources of pride and strength, but also triggers for insecurity and alienation from the cultural mainstream. This internal conflict intensifies in moments of existential reflection. When asked, "Who am I beyond my body, beyond my scars?" in ink, the core fear whispers, "You are only seen for your exterior. Your true self remains hidden and unknown." This self questioning reinforces isolation, perpetuating cycles of hiding and exposing. Yet within this darkened territory lies potential to transform the shadow into light, to tame the core fear through awareness, acceptance, and compassionate integration. Recognizing the fear's roots opens pathways toward breaking its grip, fostering new ways of relating to self and others. The poetry of this core fear is its relentless presence paired with its elusiveness. It shapes choices and actions silently, yet powerfully, guiding the tattooed woman through an ongoing internal negotiation between protection and exposure, the very tension that inspired the ritual of tattooing in the first place. In the next chapter, you will dive deeper into how these early fears evolve and reveal themselves in adult relationships and behaviors. We will illuminate the ways these internal scripts manifest as projections, defenses, and patterns that play out in the complex dance of connection and separation. The tattooed woman's core fear is not an endpoint, but a doorway. Unlocking it leads into the shadow's depths where growth begins, not to erase fear, but to live alongside it, transformed by understanding and presence. Chapter 6: Adult Manifestation, Relational Projection. The patterns carved into the psyche in childhood are never just left behind. They resurface, evolve, and echo through the corridors of adult relationships. For the tattooed woman, these early wounds, the fears, the silences, the betrayals, manifest not only in internal solitude, but in the dynamic interplay with others around her. The psychological mechanisms governing these interactions are complex, subtle, often operating beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The word to grasp here is projection, the unconscious assignment of internal conflicts, fears, and desires. Relational projection unfolds as a hidden symphony of defense and desire, a psychological dance where the tattooed woman both expects and fears rejection, contempt, or neglect from others, but simultaneously longs for deep connection and validation. This paradox forms the core of many of her interpersonal challenges and triumphs. Projection acts like a psychic mirror, reflecting back internalized beliefs and fears through the behaviors and attitudes of others. For example, when a partner becomes cold or distant, it may not simply be about their actual behavior, but a reenactment of the tattooed woman's early experiences with emotional unavailability. This mirrored dynamic reactivates old nervous system imprints, triggering hypervigilance or withdrawal. The tattooed woman's tattoos themselves often become symbolic touchstones in these relational dramas. They can attract attention, curiosity, or judgment, becoming metaphors through which others project their own assumptions, fears, or fantasies. Strangers might view her body as rebellious, dangerous, or mysterious, while close others may see her as vulnerable or unapproachable. These projections complicate her social reality, influencing not only how others treat her, but how she comes to see herself. Because projection operates largely beneath conscious awareness, the tattooed woman can be trapped in cycles where she believes others are the source of her pain, while the root lies in unresolved internal conflicts. For her, the relational arena becomes a charged space where the past and present conflate, making genuine connection difficult. One powerful manifestation is what psychologists call transference and countertransference. Transference refers to projecting feelings or attitudes originally directed at primary caregivers onto current relational partners. Countertransference is the response it evokes in others, often unconscious but deeply influential in relationship dynamics. For the tattooed woman, this means that early abandonment or neglect colors not just her expectations, but the behavior of those she lets close. This neurologically rooted replay often leads to relational patterns marked by test and retreat, the insistence on testing trustworthiness, intermixed with sudden withdrawal to avoid anticipated. It is a form of self preservation encoded deeply in the nervous system's fight or flight circuitry, yet it can feel bewildering and isolating to the woman living it. An example: she might unconsciously challenge a partner's loyalty with mounting suspicion, only to feel devastated when accusations create distance. This push pull reflects the nervous system's attempt to manage overwhelming emotions, coupled with the impossibility of trusting safety. The tattoos, etched as armor, signal a territory not easily crossed and guarded with both pride and pain. Projection also manifests in friendships and social groups. The tattooed woman may find herself oscillating between feeling embraced by alternative or creative communities and feeling excluded or misunderstood by mainstream culture. The marginalization experienced feeds her internal scripts about belonging or the lack thereof, intensifying vigilance and emotional self protection. Further complicating relational projection is the tension between conscious self narrative and unconscious relational patterns. The tattooed woman may passionately proclaim her independence, autonomy, and resilience, yet in intimate moments, old wounds resurrect vulnerability and dependence. This contradiction is not weakness, but the natural oscillation of a nervous system still learning to differentiate past from present, threat from safety. The psychological cost of projection is significant. Strained relationships, self doubt, and a repeated sense of fragmentation. However, within this cycle lies potential for profound growth if made conscious. Recognizing projection as a defensive but unconscious mechanism opens the door for insight and compassionate self reflection. From a Jungian perspective, these patterns are expressions of shadow material, parts of the self disowned or rejected early on, now externalized onto others. The tattoos themselves can be viewed as external shadow containers, visible signs of internal parts the woman has struggled to fully integrate. To embrace these projected parts, to reclaim what has been cast outward, lies at the heart of the healing journey. Understanding relational projection also reframes the way the tattooed woman interprets conflict and rejection. What once felt like personal failure can be seen as an echo from the past, an unresolved emotional script seeking new endings. This insight fosters a new kind of relationship with self and others, one grounded in curiosity rather than blame, compassion rather than judgment. The ripples of these projections influence family dynamics, romantic relationships, friendships, and even professional interactions. For instance, in family systems, the tattooed woman may unconsciously reenact original family roles such as the scapegoat or lost child through behaviors imbued with projected fears of abandonment or invisibility. These roles perpetuate covert expectations and relational scripts across generations. Romantic relationships often become the stage for particularly potent projections due to their intimacy and vulnerability. Attachment wounds buried beneath tattoos emerge in pushing away and clinginess cycles, deep emotional reactivity, and complex boundary negotiations. Clear communication can feel impossible when old fears trigger shutdown or flooding. An essential piece to this puzzle is recognizing how the tattooed woman's shadow projections trigger complementary shadows in partners or friends. People react not only to her, but to their own unresolved wounds. Thus, relational dynamics emerge as intricate dance partners, weaving shared shadow material into a collective narrative. This dynamic means healing cannot happen in isolation. It requires relational attunement, finding others willing to hold space for the tattooed woman's vulnerabilities without panic or rejection. It requires patience to move beyond projection toward authentic connection, accepting that discomfort in self and other is part of growth. A metaphor often used here is of fractured mirrors. The tattooed woman sees distortions in others that mask parts of herself. Others see their shadows in her reactions. The goal becomes mending these mirror shards through conscious witnessing and self inquiry, allowing the psyche to reunify fragmented parts. The tattooed woman's relational projections thus hold a dual message: protection born from survival wounds and invitations for healing through recognition. They are paradoxical signals, the body shouting, "Don't hurt me," while longing for "hold me." Tattoos, with their dual nature of display and concealment, visually manifest the same tension. In the chapters ahead, we will explore how these relational dynamics extend into professional arenas, self worth, boundary setting, and emotional regulation. The six hidden symptoms common in daily life will become clear signs of this archetype's ongoing negotiation with the world. But for now, witness the relational projection as an ancient survival script playing out in the theater of adult life. A script that calls not for blame, but for deep compassion, insight, and the courage to hold both light and shadow in the psychological mirror. This awareness marks the beginning of transformation, where the tattooed woman begins owning her story not only through ink on skin, but through conscious, compassionate relationship with self and others. The path is challenging but rich with possibility, a slow pilgrimage toward authenticity, where every tattooed mark, every projected shadow, maps a sacred journey back to wholeness. Chapter 7: Adult Manifestation, Career and Internal Identity. You might have noticed that the internal struggles a tattooed woman wrestles with do not stay confined to private or relational realms. As she navigates the world of career, ambition, and identity, the invisible scars and defenses ripple outward, coloring her engagement with professional life and, more deeply, her sense of self. They become imprinted in the daily tasks, decisions, and self talk, unraveled across the clockwork of her working world. They become adults who carry the weight of the past directly into the workplace, manifesting in six subtle but potent symptoms woven into career and identity struggles: self worth fragility, boundary confusion, relational complexity with authority and peers, emotional regulation challenges, identity fragmentation, and chronic overcompensation. First, the fog of self worth fragility. The tattooed woman's early wounds seed a deep, often covert, but persistent doubt in her value. Even as she achieves or performs competently, the undercurrent of "Am I enough?" winds quietly beneath her accomplishments. This feeling does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it masquerades as perfectionism or overwork. She may tirelessly prove her worth through output, visibility, or success, attempting to outpace an internal script that whispers of invisibility and rejection. This fragile self esteem is often exacerbated by societal bias against tattooed women when external judgment merges seamlessly with internalized doubt, creating a loop that saps confidence before the day even begins. Second, boundary confusion clutters her professional landscape. The lines demarcating self from other, the limits that protect personal energy and psychological space, can be elusive. Early relational wounds often teach that boundaries are either unsafe or must be overly rigid to preserve self control. As a result, tattooed women might find themselves oscillating between overextending, saying yes to demands they secretly resent, and withdrawing defensively to shield emotional wounds. These boundary struggles complicate professional collaboration, stress management, and the delicate navigation of power dynamics. Third, the arena of authority and peer relationships is rife with complexity. The tattooed woman often unconsciously replicates earlier attachment and trauma dynamics in how she perceives, approaches, or challenges figures of authority or coworkers. A supervisor's tone might unconsciously echo childhood dismissal, triggering internal alarms that influence reactions, sometimes appearing as defiance, aloofness, or withdrawal. Conversely, she might overinvest in pleasing authority figures, seeking validation that went missing early on. Peer relationships, while potentially a source of support, may instead intensify feelings of exclusion or invisibility, fed by social stigma around tattoos and misunderstood images of rebellion. Fourth, emotional regulation challenges represent a persistent internal battlefield during working hours. The nervous system's survival imprint means emotions can unpredictably surge or shut down when triggered. The tattooed woman might find herself overwhelmed by small setbacks, criticism, or ambiguity, reactions that feel out of proportion to external stimuli. To cope, she might employ dissociation, hyper control, or avoidance strategies that ultimately interfere with authentic engagement or productivity. The pressure to maintain composure in professional settings often conflicts with the internal turbulence that tattoos silently chronicle. Fifth, identity fragmentation threads a subtle but profound challenge. The ongoing tension between how she presents externally and how she experiences herself internally. Tattoos, so often crafted to declare identity, paradoxically underscore a sense of disjointedness. The external body's narrative may shout resilience, power, or defiance, while the internal self wrestles with feelings of inadequacy, fear, or confusion. This split fosters a kind of psychological dissonance where the tattooed woman's sense of who I am becomes a complex amalgam of competing stories, often leaving her unsure of stable, coherent identity. Questions swirl in quiet moments. Am I only what they see, or is there a hidden self beneath the ink? What does May really mean? Sixth and finally, chronic overcompensation emerges as a hidden yet exhausting pattern. To counteract the myriad internal fears and projected judgments, the tattooed woman often overperforms, taking on extra responsibilities, pushing beyond limits, or constructing elaborate personas of success and control. While seemingly productive, overcompensation often masks deeper vulnerabilities and perpetuates cycles of burnout, disconnection, and unrelenting self criticism. The tattooed body becomes an external metaphor for this compulsion, a permanent visible emblem of having survived pain, but also a reminder of the relentless energy devoted to self protection. These six symptoms intersect and intertwine, casting long shadows over career trajectories and internal identity development. The tattooed woman might oscillate between moments of bold expression and self sabotage, between craving recognition and distancing herself from others. Her professional path becomes not linear, but labyrinthine, complex, textured by layers of unconscious psychological navigation. Understanding these adult manifestations requires expanding the idea of identity from something fixed or singular to something dynamic and multifaceted. The tattooed woman's identity is best seen as an ongoing project of integrating fractured parts, trauma, survival, and desire entwined in persistent negotiation. Her tattoos themselves stand as markers of this process, visual signposts of a self that refuses to be reduced to past wounds, yet carries their echoes continually. This complexity trickles down to daily working life in multiple ways. You might observe oscillations between assertiveness and withdrawal in meetings, hesitation in voicing opinions, balanced by fierce strategic defense, or bursts of inspired creativity, shadowed by deep self doubt. The nervous system's survival imprint subtly influences decision making, interpersonal dynamics, and responses to stress. Societal stigma around tattoos compounds this challenge. Despite burgeoning cultural acceptance, tattooed women often face stereotyping as unprofessional or rebellious, further challenging their internal negotiations about belonging and authenticity. These external judgments can trigger the very fears concealed beneath layers of ink, creating a cultural feedback loop that aggravates self questioning and boundary struggles. But these challenges also hold immense potential for psychological growth because the tattooed woman must navigate complexity daily. She cultivates resilience, emotional depth, and nuanced self awareness. The repeated negotiation of identity fosters psychological flexibility, a capacity central to healing and transformation. As she learns to differentiate internal truths from projection, to recalibrate nervous system responses, and to assert boundaries with kindness rather than fear, the tattooed woman begins to rewrite her narrative, not only in ink, but in lived experience. This evolving self authorship embodies the archetype's deeper truth: survival is not enough, wholeness is the ultimate aim. In the coming chapters, you will explore how this process unfolds further through awareness and unlearning, the conscious dismantling of old stories and defense mechanisms. The journey moves from unconscious survival toward deliberate healing, from masking pain through external armor to integrating shadow through embodied presence. The complexity of career and identity struggles demand patience and empathy, both from the tattooed woman and those who seek to understand her. The inked skin is a map not only of past wounds, but of ongoing transformation, the visible residue of an invisible psychological odyssey toward authenticity. As you listen to this chapter, reflect on the great paradox. The very marks that signal difference also point toward the deep human urge to be known, accepted, and every tattooed woman's professional journey is thus a microcosm of that universal tension, a creative negotiation between inner fragmentation and the ever emerging self. Chapter 8: Awareness and Unlearning. Silencing the inner critic. You might have caught yourself in moments when the voice inside your head feels sharp, relentless and merciless, a whisper so persistent it sometimes feels like an echo of old wounds reverberating through every thought. This is the inner critic, that unyielding psychological sentinel that guards against vulnerability by sowing doubt, shame, and fear. For the tattooed woman, this inner critic is often amplified, informed by a lifetime of coping strategies shaped by trauma, rejection, and societal stigma. Understanding that these critical voices are not intrinsic personality traits, but rather survival mechanisms, is a turning point, a portal from self judgment to self compassion. These voices evolved to protect a fragile self, signaling danger when safety was scarce. Awareness is the key to witnessing rather than embodying the inner critic, to see it without drowning in its corrosive script. The process of awareness begins with what psychologists term metacognition, the act of thinking about thinking. This meta awareness allows the tattooed woman to recognize the recursive loops where old fears and limiting beliefs replay like scratched vinyl. Instead of fusing with the critical voice, she learns to observe it as an artifact of past pain, a conditioned response rather than an absolute truth. Awareness disrupts automaticity. It injects a pause, however brief, that enables choice instead of reactivity. This pause creates neural real estate for new possibilities and reframes old stories. When the tattooed woman begins witnessing her inner critic, she can question, who is really speaking here? What am I afraid to feel underneath this voice? This shift from identification to witnessing is what differentiates witnessing from what might be called self gaslighting, a subtle but pernicious internal silencing. The difference lies in gentle curiosity rather than denial. Witnessing accepts the presence of difficult feelings and thoughts without amplifying or suppressing them. It invites exploration rather than condemnation. One foundational tool in this practice is cultivating a compassionate inner voice, a counterbalance to the inner critic. This is not about naive positive thinking, but about cultivating an empathetic internal dialogue, grounded in understanding and acceptance. It acknowledges the survival intent behind the critical voice, yet refuses its harsh verdicts. In this delicate inner work, body awareness plays a vital role, because trauma and the inner critic live not just in thought, but deeply lodged in the nervous system. Speaking to the body itself becomes essential. The tattooed woman often carries tension, constriction, or dissociation in areas where the nervous system harbors old danger signals. Listening to these bodily cues provides essential data for regulation and integration. Nervous system regulation techniques provide a practical scaffold for this process. Practices such as mindful breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or gentle movement increase interoceptive awareness, the ability to sense internal bodily signals. This awareness cultivates safety at the somatic level, enabling the nervous system to shift from patterns of hypervigilance or shutdown into more regulated states. An especially potent aspect of inner work for tattooed women involves reconnecting with the parts of self that the inner critic seeks to bury or diminish. Jungian psychology names this realm the shadow, aspects of personality disowned, feared, or denied due to early relational wounding. Tattoos, with their evocative symbolism, often represent an external dialogue with this shadow domain, making it a visible canvas for integration. Shadow work invites the tattooed woman to welcome disowned parts, not with judgment, but with radical acceptance. This process is neither quick nor easy. It requires courage to face internal darkness, illuminated by the body's markings and the emotional memories they evoke. Through shadow work, The fragmented self begins the gentle process of reunification. Complementing shadow integration is the practice of inner child reparenting, a compassionate dialogue where the adult self offers to soothe and protect the vulnerable child within. This internal caregiver counters the inner critic's harshness with tenderness and validation. This practice weakens the critic's influence by addressing unmet childhood needs rather than perpetuating cycles of self reproach. Because the tattooed woman's nervous system has been conditioned to expect threat, creating new relational experiences internally fosters neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself. Over time, repeated compassionate witnessing and reparenting form new neural connections, enabling shifts in emotional regulation, self esteem. An essential truth emerges here. The inner critic's persistence is not evidence of failure, but of survival. For the tattooed woman, silencing the critic does not mean erasing vigilance, but learning to discern real threat from Mattis alarms rooted in old fears. This nuanced discernment is the foundation of healing. This journey is deeply tied to reclaiming agency over the narrative encoded not just in stories but on skin. The tattoos become allies rather than symbols of shame or resistance alone. They embody a history of survival now opening toward integration. Mindfulness practices enhance the capacity for witnessing by training attention in the present moment without judgment. Mindfulness helps to move beyond automatic reactivity to deliberate choice. It cultivates acceptance of the full emotional spectrum, the joy, pain, fear, and hope living simultaneously in the psyche. As you cultivate awareness and begin unlearning internalized scripts, you will encounter resistance. The inner critic fights to maintain control because it fears vulnerability and abandonment. This resistance is normal and signals the importance of your work rather than fatal. Building support systems outside yourself is crucial in this stage. Therapy, trusted friendships, and community connections provide external mirrors that confirm your worth and model adaptive relational patterns complementing the internal work. One may also face societal stigmas that reinforce the inner critic's message's judgment about tattoos, assumptions of deviance, or the cultural push to conform. Recognizing these forces situates personal struggles within a broader social context, lessening isolated shame and fostering empowerment through solidarity. It is vital, however, to differentiate between silencing the inner critic and silencing authentic feedback. Constructive self reflection invites growth, whereas the inner critic's voice often embodies rigid, harsh, and punitive messages. Learning this distinction is a developmental milestone on the path to wholeness. You might discover practical exercises helpful in this phase. Journaling from the perspective of the inner critic, and then responding as the compassionate self, engaging in somatic practices that ground you in the body and foster safety, or dialoguing with specific tattoos to uncover the stories they hold and express. At the heart of this chapter lies a radical invitation to treat yourself as a beloved wounded survivor rather than a failure or outcast, to hold gently the fractured parts that long for healing and recognition, to witness the inner critic, not as an enemy, but as a misguided sentinel whose voice can be softened with practice and patience. This practice of awareness and unlearning lays the foundation for transformation. The tattoos become more than skin deep. They evolve into embodied narratives of resilience, complexity, and emerging wholeness. In the next chapter, you will step beyond awareness into the beginning of healing itself. We will explore actionable paths, including inner child reparenting, shadow integration, and nervous system regulation that offer tangible ways forward. Healing begins not with fixing, but with presence and compassion. The journey from silencing the inner critic to hearing the compassionate voice is the heart of reclaiming autonomy encoded on skin, mind, and soul. It is an ongoing, courageous pilgrimage, a sacred negotiation between survival and thriving that ultimately honors the preciousness of the tattooed woman's being. Chapter 10, Conclusion and Affirmation, Wholeness and the Final. The goal is not to be fixed, but to become whole. These words hold the final, resonant truth of this journey, a truth that echoes through the layers of ink and psyche, pain and transformation, shadow and light carried by the tattooed woman. Wholeness is not synonymous with perfection or the absence of wounding. Rather, it is the embrace of complexity, the reconciliation of fractured parts into an integrated, radiant self. From the earliest imprints of silence and invisibility, through the nervous system's ancient battlefields, and into the tangled dance of relationships and identity, this story is a pilgrimage of survival moving toward renewal. The tattoos, those vivid, tactile maps, navigate not only outer skin, but inner territories, telling a narrative that dares to claim voice, embodied presence, and autonomy where once there was only disconnection and despair. In the words of the great Carl Jung, whose work illuminated the shadowed corners of the psyche that are too often hidden or dismissed, we find a guiding light. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This profound insight captures the essence of the tattooed woman's journey. The visible ink is a manifestation of that making conscious, the externalization of internal darkness into a symbol, a story, a work of personal myth. It is a radical acknowledgement that healing begins not through denial or avoidance of pain, but through the courageous act of facing and integrating it. To become whole is to cease fighting the fragmented self, to no longer dissociate the parts that were once too painful to hold. The trajectory of wholeness is a weaving shadows stitched with light, ruptures mended with acceptance, fears softened by compassion. The tattooed woman embodies this ancient alchemy, her body a living testament to the possibility that brokenness itself contains the seeds of becoming. This final chapter is an invocation and affirmation. It invites every tattooed woman, and indeed anyone who carries invisible wounds, to honor the resilience encoded in their body stories. Regardless of how heavy the past feels or how deep the scars run, the possibility of reconnection, presence, and love remains alive. The path to wholeness is marked by these key principles: presence over avoidance, engaging with pain and fear rather than suppressing or escaping them, compassion over judgment, releasing harsh self criticism in favor of empathy and understanding, integration over fragmentation, welcoming disowned aspects of self into conscious awareness, agency over submission, claiming autonomy and voice despite internal and external challenges, connection over isolation, building relational safety that supports healing and growth. The journey also recognizes that healing is ongoing, cyclical, and at times arduous. It asks for patience with oneself and space for grace. The yardstick is not speed, but depth and authenticity. The tattooed woman's story urges us to rewrite cultural narratives about tattoos and bodies that have long marginalized or stigmatized visible displays of difference. It calls for a broader embrace of embodiment in all its forms, honoring the sacred intersection of pain and creativity, survival and artistry. In closing, consider the transformative power of viewing tattooed skin not as a canvas of defiance alone, but as a profound text of survival and becoming. Each inked line is a stanza in the epic poem of the self, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes fierce, always deeply human. This final affirmation holds space for your own story to unfold with courage and grace. Whether your marks are visible or invisible, known or secret, each one carries a voice longing for acknowledgement and wholeness. If you found resonance in this journey, consider sharing it with others who may carry their own silent stories beneath skin and soul. Subscribe to continue exploring the depths of psychology, symbolism, and healing. Walk the path together, never alone. Remember, the goal is not to be fixed, but to become whole. Walk gently, breathe deeply. You are already more than the sum of your scars. You are a living, breathing tapestry of endurance, beauty, and The journey continues.